I think a lot of philosophers try to treat their character challenges through through their ideas, and I've done that as well. But I guess I just don't think of these as separate. I don't think, like I say, I don't think philosophy can drive you to despair, but despair can drive you to philosophy, I guess, or whatever. So.
So on the question of philosophy as therapy, it is the case that we're nervous about that, partly because it sounds like all those, and actually in some ways is like all those self-help nostrums and therapies that are out there and that you see written about in the bookstores. And I guess there's a nervousness. Are we doing any better than these self-help people? Or maybe they're doing really very well themselves. But I think professional philosophy has, in its desire to be pure and respectable and maybe somewhat scientific, has gotten away from the idea that philosophy has anything to do with your life. And but we still study Plato and Aristotle, so all of us philosophers know that it does, at least in its ancient roots, have a lot to do with how you live your life.
In some ways, I don't draw a strong distinction between philosophy and psychology, and in some ways, my conception of philosophy is of a kind of therapy. And partially that's because of my sense of what philosophy is in general. I don't think of philosophy as an isolated discipline so much as I think of it as our most rigorous attempts to heighten and improve the quality of our perception. So I think in a way philosophy is a grab bag. Philosophy is using whatever resources you can to improve the quality of your grasp of your own situation, improve the quality of your ability to deal with it. And since many of the most important issues in our life have to do with psychology, with the intimate details of how we think, how we feel, how we relate to others, much of the most important philosophical work is going to pertain to those issues. My own interest is primarily in these psychological issues because I think that is where philosophy touches us most directly, and in some ways I think that's where the changes can happen that will have the most impact on people. So I've devoted myself more to those kinds of questions. So I have taken my philosophical investigations into the domain of psychology primarily, but I don't think that's all that philosophy can do, and I don't by any means mean to diminish the importance of very, very abstract, very technical, conceptual thinking, either for the sake of that thinking, just to improve our ability to conceptualize, or in other areas, thinking about the deepest questions about foundations of the physical universe or anything else. So I think all of those things are entirely legitimate and indeed essential to philosophical inquiry. But for me, the most meaningful domain is the domain of personal, intimate, emotional life, and indeed but I should also say that itself obviously cannot really be separated from political life and all these other issues. But that's primarily where my work has been located.
I think as philosophers we should admit that from the beginning, that there's a therapeutic dimension to philosophy. Not that philosophy is therapy, but I think there is an irreducible therapeutic dimension to it that we should acknowledge. I get suspicious, disbelieving when I like to ask people how they got into philosophy too. For example, when we interview people, and I often always like to ask them what got you into it, and oftentimes you get tales of I was reading this text in Kant, and this led me to this problem, and that led to that problem, and I'm puzzled. I said that can't be why you got into philosophy. That can't be why you're devoting your life to this subject matter. Doesn't it in some way, come back to some form of self-understanding? I think Goodman had it right when he tells us that all understanding is ultimately self-understanding. I take that as a given, and that's what we're on. We're on a quest for self-understanding. So that's certainly part of it. But then there's a social dimension too. Questions of citizenship. I think philosophy can do so much more to attune us better to our world, to the problems around us, to sensitize us to the sufferings of those around us, to people throughout the world, and that can be transformed into, I think, powerful motivations for change. So I think that's how I would see the return on investments. It's both personal, but social, political as well.
Wittgenstein is the person who uses this word therapy, and this is something that Cavell picked up in his earliest writing about Wittgenstein. And I think Cavell countered the professional tendency to ask the question, well, what's his system? What theses is he arguing for? And what's his argument for the theses? If you think of it as that, as a kind of a treatise or some sort of a proof of some set of propositions, then therapy doesn't seem to enter into it. And it's possible to treat Wittgenstein as setting out some sort of a system. But if you read him carefully, you'll see that he says philosophy has different treatments of problems like different therapies. And so Cavell took that seriously and wondered, well, what kind of therapy is going on in the work? And what does this therapy look like, and how is it instantiated or encouraged by the way Wittgenstein writes? And if you ask that question, then you pretty soon come to pay attention to the fact that Wittgenstein's work is full of questions, it's full of metaphors, it's full of things that sort of hang in the air. It's full of dialogues with these voices. One voice that Cavell calls the voice of temptation, which is often what a philosopher is doing. And the other voice, the voice of correction or the voice of authority. And so Wittgenstein's work has these multiple voices, it has these multiple styles in it. How does this produce therapy? Well, or how does this encourage, or how is this therapeutic? I think Wittgenstein's view is that a lot of philosophy results from certain kinds of fixation, as Dewey said, like the quest for certainty, or a feeling that there has to be a rule out there in nature that tells us how words are used, or things that have to be. We have these fixations and unexamined assumptions. And so all these dialogues, all these questions are meant to sort of bring us up short and to make the reader do some work. If philosophy is therapy, then it's not just a passive receiving of some ideas. It invites you to do some work on yourself and on your own conceptions. And I think he sees that Wittgenstein is up to that. And I think Emerson is really very much up to this as well.
I think the great philosophers, and I would, perhaps with some reservations, but I would count Wittgenstein as he grew older and suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, various very bad experiences, traumatic, not just in the trenches on the German side in the First World War, but the whole issue of his homosexuality, for example, dogged him. And he quite clearly in his last work talks about what he called the ethical. I think it'd be better to call it the holy or the sacred even. His earlier picture theory of meaning, atomic facts, and molecular facts, picturing states of affairs in the world, he rejects. Because if the picture theory of meaning is complete and sweeping, then we should be able to picture the way the picturing happens. But we can't do that. We can't picture the picturing. And when the positivists invited him to the Vienna Circle in the 30s, they were mainly relying upon his earlier book, the famous Tractatus. But what he did when he got to Vienna was to read poetry such as Rabindranath Tagore, and they thought that he had gone soft in the head and prematurely senile or whatever, and dismissed him. But he also had this Socratic, what to call it, turn at the end of towards the end of his life.
I guess that's Wittgenstein's view, that philosophy has some kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. That's true. what he thinks of as false necessities. Partly in Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein is correcting his own earlier work in the Tractatus. I mean, this view of philosophy as therapy comes out in his later work, The Philosophical Investigations. Every word must stand for something. And so you ask, well, what does each word stand for? Well, the word table stands for tables, or maybe this table. You already start having problems, but it seems so obvious that every word has a meaning, and then the meaning is some sort of an object. So you go looking for the object, and then you have a real puzzle because you get a word like if, and you ask, well, what's the object that if stands for? And you can, actually, William James does this. You can think, well, if stands for a certain feeling of hesitation. Actually, James introspects and says, I think that feeling of hesitation is just between my throat and my neck, or something like that, and that's where it is. And by the time then you sort of back up, if you're a Wittgensteinian philosopher or a certain kind of philosopher, and you think, the meaning of the word is a little feeling in your neck? That's really bizarre, and it raises further questions about how my feeling and your feeling line up, and you're off on the high seas of philosophy. You could answer all these questions. I think Wittgenstein's part of a tradition that includes Kant, which is putting forward a critique of philosophy, a treatment for philosophical problems. And so in some cases anyway, rather than taking the problem at its face value and saying, well, here's how you solve it, the critique says, well, let's get to the place before we get off the ground with the problem. And in this case, you would get to the question, well, do you really think that a word's meaning is some sort of object? And do you really think that every word stands for something? So Wittgenstein's therapy is a treatment of certain philosophical compulsions. They're not just taught to you in graduate school or to philosophers in graduate school, according to Wittgenstein, and I think he's right about this. They're natural human compulsions, and that's where part of the interest lies. If we could only just change our curriculum, then we'd get rid of these problems. That would be easy. But the kinds of losing of your way that you find in philosophy just keeps coming up again and again. And that's why you need this therapy sort of continuously. One of the paradoxes of Wittgenstein's approach is that he says both that philosophy is a form of therapy, but it's a form of therapy that treats philosophical problems. So philosophy is both the disease, well, philosophy names a disease and names a cure for the disease. And that does sound paradoxical. I guess you could remove the paradox by saying good, effective philosophy enables you not to catch the bad philosophical disease. Another way I like to think about this is that's suggested by what he says. Wittgenstein says that his methods and his therapies have as a goal the achieving of a certain kind of peace, so that you're no longer tormented by problems that would otherwise torment you. So I see his method as not trying to end even the philosophy that's kind of diseased, but as allowing you to release it and get the fantasy out, get the compulsion out, and look at it, but then not to be bound by it, to give you some sort of freedom from it. Philosophy as a form of therapy is the treatment of itself. It contains both the cure and the problems.